I hope everyone had a chance to grab some food. And as a reminder, there'll be food served throughout the day, so feel free to refresh your plates. As we go on throughout the day. So I hope you enjoyed the program so far. I think we had two very, very interesting, compelling panels this morning. One focused more on a regional outlook in the Iran context, and one focused on U.S. administrative policy. Of course, we would be remiss, I think, given everything that's happened and all the discussions regarding the JCPOA and certification or decertification and sanctions waivers, if we didn't have a conversation as well about the legislative outlook. Things that are coming down the pike in the Congress and the House and the Senate, and how we're going to deal with sanctions going forward with Iran. And to address that issue, I think we have a very, very esteemed panel here to dive into these issues. We have a current serving member of the House and two former members of the House and Senate, both of whom were involved in Iran sanctions before it was a fashionable thing to do, well before, in fact. So we're very privileged to be joined by Congressman Ron DeSantis. He serves as a U.S. Representative for Florida's 6th Congressional District. He's served there since 2013. He serves as chairman of the U.S. House Oversight Subcommittee on National Security. Congressman DeSantis has been a leader on issues ranging from government accountability, fiscal responsibility, and terrorism, and has spearheaded efforts to reform the VA, stop the Iranian nuclear threat, among many, many, many issues. We're very, very honored to have him here. Senator Mark Kirk is also joining us. We're privileged to have him. He retired from Congress in 2016, as many as you know. He was serving as the Appropriations Subcommittee Chairman of Military Construction and Veterans Affairs and the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Subcommittee Chairman of National Security and International Trade and Finance, among many other committee leadership roles. Senator Kirk also served in the House of Representatives for 10 years prior to the Senate and as a Naval Intelligence Officer for 23 years. I don't have to say this, but during his time in Congress, Senator Kirk was one of the, if not the most tireless proponent and advocate for human rights, as well as efforts to hold Iran accountable. And we're very, very proud to call him a board member of United Against Nuclear Iran. Senator Kirk. We're also joined by Congressman Steve Israel. He served as U.S. Representative for New York's 3rd Congressional District for 16 years and currently serves as chairman of the Long Island University Global Institute. In Congress, he served as a member of both the House Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, and also served as chair of the DCCC for 2 election cycles. In addition to his role as LIU, Congressman Israel is also an author, frequent political commenter in the media, and serves on the boards of Long Island University, the Truman National Security Project, the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and many, many others. And lastly, our moderator for this panel is Dr. Michael Makovsky. Dr. Makovsky is president and CEO of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, or JINSA. Dr. Makovsky is an expert on U.S. national security issues and has worked extensively on subjects ranging from Iran's nuclear program in the Middle East and the intersection of international energy markets and politics with U.S. national security. He has a PhD in diplomatic history from Harvard University, MBA in finance from Columbia Business School, and a BA in history from the University of Chicago. He's also a good friend and overall mensch. We're very, very lucky to have this distinguished panel here. Please welcome them. Thank you.
Nice to be here. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Appreciate, great to see such a great crowd here today at this really impressive UANI conference. Look, I actually just was looking at my laptop and seeing what I just read or skimmed through Trump's speech at the UN on certainly on the Iran elements. He didn't really signal too much, except he mentioned talk about the Iran deal being an embarrassment. And he said it's not the last we're going to hear of it. So I would actually, Iran has clearly returned to the front pages here, and the administration is still conducting its policy review. It's been going on for months. And I think there's going to be 2 elements that we hope to hear about soon. One will be what the administration intends to do about the growing Iranian influence on the ground in Syria. which I think is an extremely pressing issue. And I think President Trump just mentioned that we have to check their destabilizing activities. What that means, hopefully we'll find out soon enough. I think for this panel, though, it's the other element we'll want to talk about, and it's the issue of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal. And as Trump said today, we'll hear more about the Iran deal. He obviously was very reluctant to certify, as he's required to do in Congress, Iranian compliance and that this deal remains in the national interest of the United States. And now, I'd like to address that first. And I just want to say that the session here is on the legislative outlook on Iran. Now, I think the members of Congress here, former and active, know very well that foreign policy is driven by the president, but that Congress could have a major role in influencing that policy or kind of leading the president. For instance, I have on my left Senator Kirk. He knows very well what a leadership role he took on sanctions that President Obama was reluctant to impose, but Congress passed the sanctions sometimes 100-0, so he had to proceed. So Congress could have a very important role going forward. And President Trump seems to have shown a willingness on some issues, or it suggests to let Congress take a lead on some matters. So I think Congress going forward on Iran can play a very important role. Despite obviously its limitations, we know that even though the majority of Congress opposed the Iran deal, it passed anyway. I would like to ask, and I'd like to start with Senator Kirk, of course, one of the leaders in the Senate on Iran sanctions, and obviously oppose the Iran deal. I'd like to ask you, do you think President Trump should decertify, or whatever the appropriate language is, the Iranians on this deal? And if he does do that, what would you want Congress to do, and what do you think they would do? So I'll start with you, Senator.
I'll start off by saying that I hope he doesn't certify that they're in compliance with the agreement. I would hope that we would just back away from this agreement and make sure that everything about it is let go. And I was Greek bearing gifts. I would say that Dodie, as she's passing out, I got a casualty list of Americans killed by Iranian terror that's broken out by state. Very helpful when you're lobbying United States senators. The states are in alphabetical order. 290 Americans killed directly by Iranian terror. And if you see behind Steve Israel there is the Nasra Institute, probably the best example of a human rights case that we have. She's a famous human rights lawyer in Iran, thrown in jail because of her human rights advocacy, a mother of 3 thrown into Evin prison. And when the Iranians heard I was going to make a big deal out of her case, they even let her out for a visit to her family. And it shows that pressure does work. And I do have a couple of specific requests of this group. Would say that the one missing thing in my advocacy that I never had, that I think we should really develop, is a list of gay Iranians who have been executed by the regime. We really do need that. In some cases, I've seen them, gay Iranians even being hung from U.S. equipment, equipment that's built in the United States. A crane might have been built in Peoria, Illinois by a Caterpillar, with a heartbreaking picture that you see. And if I could just go out there to say, if we could get this list together, we could bring the entire Eastern media on our side, and especially Democrats in Congress, as liberal as Steve Israel here. Yeah.
You notice I'm sitting on the far left, by the way. Your far left.
But I got to open it up to Steve-O that we had a very interesting lunch with Javid Zarif, the current foreign minister of Iran, where one Democrat and one Republican from the House came, and it was a Twilight Zone event where he starts 45 minutes into how the Holocaust didn't happen. And I eventually stopped him because I was afraid I was going to cause a diplomatic incident. And I said, I'm sorry here, Mr. Ambassador. I'm stunned that you're talking about issues that happened more than 50 years ago and not in your country. And he said, I understand this, what this has on the ears of Americans. I was directed to raise the subject with you.
Yep.
And he sort of said, I've been working so hard here to keep Iran out of the Security Council, but they don't know much about foreign policy. When an ambassador is trashing his own government, I kind of picked up on that from my days in the State Department. And I turned to Javid, I said, are you preparing to defect? Right. We could arrange you to get into a cab and go to some place, and we'll grab you there. Was hoping we could get a good recruitment there. And over that tea and pistachios, that was great, where we had a good experience there.
Yep.
Maybe on that note,
Sure. Well, thanks so much. Can you hear me? Is this working? No. Hello? Okay. Now? No.
Not on.
Oh, we'll get that fixed.
Why don't you go to the congressman and then I'll pipe in? It says it's on, but why don't we? Oh, there you go. There you go. All right.
See how much influence members of Congress would have. Yes.
I'll respond to your question, but let me take you guys behind the scenes to that rare bipartisan meeting with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, and tell you what good fortune it is to be with you, to be with Congressman DeSantis and my friend Senator Kirk. He called me and he said, "Listen, I have a proposal for you. How would you like to come with me to the UN mission on, I guess it was Fifth Avenue, and have a meeting with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations?" And I said, "You're out of your mind." I said, "There's no way I'd want to do that." And he said, "No, we should do it. We should have a conversation with him." And actually, Department of Defense had not discouraged us from going, and some would even say they may have encouraged us to go unofficially. And we showed up at that mission, and doors locked. There's a doorbell. We noticed that there's a camera lens above us, and another camera lens, and another camera lens. We ring the bell. We ring it 2 or 3 times. We're waiting. And we also noticed that there are some cameras across the street focused on us, and probably cameras on the roof, if not cameras on drones overhead. And Senator Kirk said, "You do know that we are the most photographed people on earth right now." And I said, "Does that include Chuck Schumer?" Because if it does, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Let me answer your question very briefly. Look, if the president, the question, should he recertify? If he finds clear and compelling evidence that there are breaches of the agreement, yes, of course he should certify. We know that Iran has already exceeded the cap on heavy water. That we know. They've admitted it. There are many who believe that Iran has far more advanced centrifuges than they are saying. We know that they have violated UN Resolution 2231, which enshrines the JCPOA in terms of ballistic missile tests and in terms of arms transfers. Those were the 2 reasons I voted against the JCPOA. By the way, as the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, as a senior member of House Democratic leadership, having listened to President Obama in my cloakroom, Ron, for 25 minutes, reminding me that I was a Democratic leader, I still voted against the JCPOA for those 2 reasons. And so, if there is clear and compelling evidence, yes, he should. But I believe, and this is my final point on this, I believe that he ought to use this moment in order to demonstrate some leverage on the P5+1, on the EU and others. I think, the UN speech today as a Democrat, what he said I think was very important. He needs to be signaling that he may not certify compliance with the agreement. Because if he does, that gives him some leverage to renegotiate some of the terms of the agreement, specifically with respect to missiles, with respect to arms transfers to Hezbollah and others. And he can bring in partners that were not included in the negotiations before, specifically Israel and our Arab allies. If he does that, I think we have an opportunity to improve the deal.
Congressman DeSantis.
Well, thank you for having me. I remember when before I was in Congress, in the military, And I was deployed into Al-Anbar province in Iraq back in 2007. If you remember, that was kind of the height of the Sunni Arab insurgency, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and affiliated groups, and that was what consumed the media, places like Fallujah, Ramadi. But the interesting thing was when you got on the ground there, yes, there were obviously problems there. That was the main reason why there was a surge of forces. You developed a counterinsurgency approach that did have success. But the thing that I noticed immediately reading intelligence reports was that most of our combat deaths were not at the hands of Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Sunni Arabs. It was at the hands of Iranian-backed groups, the Quds Force, the Shia militia. You had Qasem Soleimani, who was on the ground there. They had the most powerful IEDs called EFPs, and they killed hundreds of our service members during the Iraq campaign. It's not discussed that much, but it is 100% true, and this is a regime that has been maniacally opposed to us and our interests from the day that Islamic Revolution was put into place. And so you have to see this stuff through that prism and through their worldview. And I think to me, the speech today was a strong signal he's not going to recertify. Right. He did not want to recertify it last time. His advisors basically said, look, we still got to go through this review. So he begrudgingly did it. But I don't know in good faith how you can recertify it. Can you say that they are abiding by the deal? Steve mentioned the centrifuges. You have the heavy water. We don't have access to all the sites. If we want access to a military site, we don't get access to that. So I think it's hard to do that. And then I think it's even doubly hard seeing how they've behaved since this deal was enacted to say that this is somehow in the vital interest of the United States to allow them to have more money going into their regime. You see them wreaking havoc throughout the region. They have a nuclear infrastructure in place. And even if they keep the deal, they're a nuclear power. So I think his campaign commitments, his worldview, and then the facts on the ground make it very, very difficult to see how you could recertify this deal.
Let me follow up. Well, thank you very much for your service, lad, in the military before you went into Congress.
Sure.
So if I could ask you, since yours, and then ask the other Congressman Israel and Senator Kirk, what do you think then Congress, if he does do that, and it does suggest it, as you say, then what do you, then the baton is passed to Congress. They could reimpose sanctions, or they might, based on the legislation Corker-Cardin, or they might not. And it's not clear to me, even if the administration decertified, that they want Congress to reimpose or not. So I would like to ask you, and then Congressman Israel and Senator Kirk, and obviously with the Democrats are going to have a big say on this, what would you like Congress to do if he does that, and what do you think Congress would do, actually?
Well, look, Senator Kirk had mentioned, I mean, the Iran deal did not get even a majority, much less 2/3 in the Senate for the ratified treaty. So you had a majority of both houses oppose the deal to begin with. That means that those senators and congressmen wanted to continue with sanctions. So I think you have clear majorities that would want to reimpose sanctions. And at the end of the day, I mean, I look at it as, okay, we see what's going on with what the president calls the Rocket Man in North Korea. And there's a debate about how rational Kim Jong-un is. I mean, you look at it, surely he knows that if he were to launch a missile against Guam or the continental United States, it'd be the end of his country. Surely he believes that, right? Well, look, I mean, I think he probably understands that. But he's a 32-year-old kid who, if he was, not born to that family, he'd probably be in someone's basement eating Cheetos and playing video games. So you don't know what he would do. But I look at that problem as difficult as it is, and you put the Iranian regime in that position, that problem is much more intractable because their worldview is such that the idea that they would be destroyed in retaliation may not be a deterrent, it may be an inducement to them to act. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is what can we do in the Congress with the tools that we have to try to change the course so that we don't end up in 3, 4, 5, 10 years with Iran where we are in North Korea. And so I would say The toughest sanctions you can do are the financial sanctions, where you're making some of these other countries choose between doing business with Iran or doing business with the United States. And if you do that, then it can have some bite, even on a unilateral level. I would love to get other countries on board with us, but these European countries don't face the same threat from Iran that we do or that Israel does. They make a lot of money with Iran, and so their interests are just not aligned with ours 100% on this. So yes, I think you would have clear majorities that would reimpose it. And look, this is just the way politics works. I mean, with Obama not being president anymore, there's going to be less pressure for Democrats to want to uphold the deal going forward. Just like if Trump adopts a position, there's a lot of pressure for Republicans to just kind of fall in line. It's just the way politics is. So I think you'll see some Democrats who voted for the Iran deal support reinstituting some sanctions. I do. I don't know how many, but I do think you will see some.
Congressman Israel, do you agree with that?
There are a couple things. Number one, there is nothing that actually, can you still hear? Okay. There's nothing that actually requires, compels, or mandates Congress to take a vote on anything after the president certifies that either Iran is upholding the deal or decertifies. So there's no requirement. The president, your point is well taken. The president can just say, look, I'm doing this I am snapping back sanctions by executive order. If Congress wants to join me, that's fine. If they don't want to join me, that's fine. But the president could argue that he has that authority under executive order. Here's what it would likely look like, I think. President can, under the terms of the legislation enshrining JCPOA, President can notify Ron and his colleagues in Congress that he believes that there is a breach of the Iran deal. Then the president has 30 days to get back to Ron and his colleagues in Congress and say, I think this breach is significant, it's material. Then, if Congress wants, that expedites a congressional process. The leaders of the House and Senate, both parties, can introduce a legislation snapping back sanctions. That immediately goes to committee. It has 10 days to come out of committee, goes to the floor of the House under expedited consideration, 2 hours of debate, and it's done. Congress can do that, or it may decide not to do that. President can decertify, right? Can say that Iran, he cannot certify Iran's compliance. He can continue to waive sanctions. The legislation allows him to do that. He can modify the sanctions. He can say, I don't want to repeal the waiver on all sanctions, but I'm going to snap back secondary sanctions on Iran Airlines or Iran shipping. Or maybe he agrees that the IRGC should be designated as a terrorist organization, something I happen to agree with, and I'm only sorry I couldn't co-sponsor that bill since leaving Congress. So there's lots of options. Finally, on this question, I think it's important to understand, so we now know what that would look like. The president can say to Congress, I'm not going to certify. The president can certify, and then Congress can on its own say, you're wrong. We disagree. We want to snap back sanctions. The president can do kind of a dreamer's deal and say, I'm going to certify because I'm getting all this pressure from my staff, but I'll let Congress decide what to do with sanctions. It should be their decisions. The other important aspect of this is, what is the effect of that on a broader stage? Outside of the politics of Washington, D.C., what's the impact? And my guess is that anything other than certification, I'm not arguing for certification, just trying to take you through some likely scenarios. Anything other than certification, number one, the parties to the JCPOA will scream and yell and protest that decision. The EU will scream and yell and protest that decision. I don't think the administration really cares much about their screaming and yelling. They will ask the administration to deliver to them evidence of a material breach. They will demand to know whether the administration corroborated with the IAEA. And if you have the IAEA saying, no, we don't find a breach, and you have the administration saying, yes, there is, that creates doubt. And the more doubt in the environment, the easier it is for our allies and others on the world stage to say, well, you may decide that to decertify, and you may decide not to have sanctions, but we're not going to participate because there's no clear or compelling evidence. Which is to say, if the administration chooses this route, they need to present clear and compelling evidence to the public, to other countries, so that there is no doubt and no debate as to Iran's failure to live up to the terms of the agreement. One final thing on this, with apologies. Iran's most likely scenario, depending on what the president does, if he snaps back secondary sanctions, which is called delisting, my guess is, and my colleagues may disagree with me, my guess is Tehran would tolerate that. If he snaps back sanctions that really hit at the regime, my guess is that they would declare that the United States has breached the deal, and then have the ability and the right to either stay with the deal or resume their nuclear program. So there are a lot of implications that we have to understand before this decision is made. And you can only understand properly when you have transparent and public information.
Let me just follow up with you on that before I go to the center. Congressman DeSantis rightly pointed out that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspections, are not as advertised in 2015. The Iranians have been allowed to self-inspect, which is rather amazing. It's like you go to a drug dealer's house and say, any drugs in this house? You look around and say, okay, no drugs. The FBI moves on. Okay, thank you very much. And that's kind of what you have, especially on the suspected military side of Parchin. So one is we don't know. And
Correct.
How would that play, you think? And do you agree that with Congressman DeSantis, if I may say that, without President Obama as president, do you think some Democrats that felt pressured before, like you were pressured, but did vote for the deal, would be willing to change their votes now, you think?
Well,
if there was good evidence.
Yeah, so let me just qualify one thing you said, and that is, and I think Ron would agree, and the senator would agree, that it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican on high-stakes bills, you're pressured. Pressure is the one thing that is bipartisan in Washington, D.C. So, yes, the President of the United States would say I didn't pressure, I educated, and some of my colleagues felt pressured. It doesn't matter. I do agree with Ron, with Congressman DeSantis. See, when you leave Congress, you start calling people by their first names again. It's very nice. And you start smiling again because you don't have to raise money anymore. I do agree with Ron that there would be a larger number of Democrats voting on a bill to snap back sanctions, but it depends on the quality of the information they receive, and that's only fair. Republicans deserve that too. And so if there is clear, compelling evidence of material breaches, yeah, you'll get a far more serious number of Democrats. If the argument is just, deep with doubt and possible theories, et cetera, you're going to get fewer Democrats supporting the bill. It's about the quality of the evidence at the end of the day.
Senator Kirk, do you want to address this discussion on these
I would
issues
say
and the
that,
Democratic element of that?
Many of you might think, like I think, that the current structure of international politics today reminds us of 1938. And probably the dominant question of our lives, should we be living in a 1938 time? What would we do? I think the number one issue before us to make sure the next generation of Americans does not have to clean up a nuclear war in the Middle East. Make sure that that does not happen. In my case, I spent most of my time in the Senate trying to find the highest impact, lowest cost sanction that I could find that would be likely to be adopted. For me, the best, highest impact, lowest cost impact sanction that I would suggest for the current time that I think I could get the most votes for in the Senate is a resolution that would call on the government of Great Britain to get Lloyd's to spend all insurance for tankers bringing refined gasoline to Iran. In that, I remember the Iranians are totally dependent on the Jahangir refinery in India, and they have so neglected their refining capacity. We would draw the Iranian economy to a close by cutting off tanker traffic to make sure that no one could insure that traffic bringing gasoline to Iran.
Let me ask you, by the way, I should add, and I should mention, if anyone has questions, there'll be people walking around, and you could fill out questionnaires. They'll bring them up to the front. Oh, you have some already? Okay. Let me follow up with you, Senator, on that. I'm sorry to press this issue, but it seems like we live in such divisive times, although now things seem a little more scrambled recently, like with the Dreamers issue. But You were in the trenches on the Iran sanctions as much as anyone. You worked, there's Kirk Menendez, very famous, you had to work with Democrats. What's your sense in the Senate on this issue about how you think Democrats, how they would react? Would they have convincing evidence of Iranian violation of the deal? You think they would, support reimposition of sanctions, even though they supported the deal in 2015?
The solution now is much easier because I think we have a president that wouldn't use his veto pen. And with President Obama, we had the veto pen to overcome, and the partisan dynamic where, as Mitch McConnell would say, we all turn into shirts and skins. If you turn the Congress into shirts and skins, then you're going to win a veto battle.
Okay.
And when I took the Senate to vote on Menendez-Kirk a couple of times, we got the vote of every single Democratic senator, even Bernie Sanders.
I'd like to...
He's not a Democrat.
I'd like to ask also a question that Congressman Israel raised about declaring the Islamic Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. Do you think that will come up in this current debate on Iran?
I hope so.
And you think there'd be congressional support for such a declaration?
I think should be. Based on that list of American casualties, Ron, you raised the issue of American killed by Iranian terror, of which the Joint Chiefs of Staff estimate about 500 American soldiers were killed by EFBs. Remember, Ron mentioned the explosively formed penetrators was the first thing we see on the battlefield that could defeat the M1 tank. Before these EFPs came in from Iran, when an American soldier got an M1 tank, he knew he was going to live that day. Because of Iran technology, we don't know if you're going to live the next day when you're in your M1. And those casualties are across the country. Would hope you look over all this. There's 40 states where we have Americans killed by Iranian terror. And that includes the hundreds of Marines from 1983 when the Iranians blew up the Marine barracks there, and the 500 soldiers that served alongside Ron.
And on that, Congressman DeSantis, where do you see legislation on that, given what you just said, and Senator Kirk and Congressman Israel also?
Well, I mean, if you're fomenting terrorism, if you're supporting terrorism, if you're aiding and abetting terrorism, you're a terrorist group. I mean, come on, this is, to me, is very obvious looking at how the IRGC operates, particularly looking at the Quds Force. One of the disturbing things about this deal, I remember, was as soon as the deal was enacted, you had Soleimani showing up, in all these places. This is not good. So I think absolutely they should be designated.
What would you think, Congressman Israel, what do you think would then be the implications for Iran if such legislation passed? And assuming President Trump would sign it.
There are two bills in the House that have been introduced to declare the IRGC as terrorist organizations. One by Congressman Ted Poe from Texas. It directs the president to declare them as a terrorist organization. It has a total of 9 co-sponsors. The other was introduced by another Texas Republican, your colleague, Mike McCall. It expresses the sense of the House of Representatives that the president should declare the IRGC as a terrorist organization, which is a much easier thing for people to support when you're just expressing an opinion as opposed to directing the president to do something. And that has a grand total of 22 co-sponsors in the House. So right now, and Ron would know far better than me because I've been gone for 10 months, 17 days and 6 hours, but who's counting? But a bill with 22 co-sponsors or 9 co-sponsors, I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. And what would be the response by Iran to the extent that it matters at all? My guess is they would treat that as on par. Mark, you know more than I do. They treat that as on par as trying to dismantle Iran Airways or trying to dismantle Iran shipping, and could use that to declare that the United States has breached the agreement, violated the agreement, and that they're going to respond in a variety of ways, up to and including resuming their nuclear program.
I guess part of the idea behind this is because there are a lot of companies under the IRGC sector, so therefore they actually have a lot of influence. So if you declare them a terrorist organization, you have a ripple effect on dealing with a lot of elements of the Iranian economy. Let me ask you on another thing that, and there was a question about this, and I'm glad there was, because I was thinking about the same thing, is something that's not in the deal, is the ballistic missile issue. To me, one of the most egregious elements of the deal is not necessarily what was in it. There's a lot of egregious elements in it, but what was not in it, which is restricting their ballistic missile development. It is mentioned, I believe, in the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which incorporates the deal, but it's only in an annex, I think page 99, and it doesn't really, it calls upon Iran not to develop their ballistic missile program, but not to actually, it doesn't prohibit them like a previous UN Security Council list. What could Congress do on this issue, if anything? Could there have been some sanctions on their ballistic missile development. Is there anything more? And I'm going to throw out an idea just if you could address. I wonder if Congress could also have hearings on this issue. You hear people talking about this with North Korea already, but it seems to me there should be some discussion whether we should shoot down ballistic missiles coming out of Iran. I mean, they fired a ballistic missile into Syria in June. We didn't do anything. It seems to me that would send a strong signal if we tell them if they fire any more outside their territory. But maybe Congress should do hearings on that issue. Or there could be other things. I just want to know, what do you all think about addressing, Senator, on the ballistic missile issue?
Congress would really help out the situation by explaining and exploring a truth that we all know. The North Korean missile program is the same thing as the Iranian missile program. Okay. That the Hwasong-14, which flew over Hokkaido, was unfortunately flying at such an altitude that the THAAD batteries there could not reach her. And that gave them a capability. Remember, the morning that I want to avoid here, if we work things out, you're brushing your teeth and your best friend calls on your cell phone. Stop, put down everything, go to CNN. Iran has just fired a salvo of Shahab-3 missiles, which are 99% North Korean, and wiped out Israel. So 60 years of Zionism is gone. We've got to make sure that what took decades and thousands of lives is not erased in just a couple of minutes of missile combat.
So what do you think Congress could do to raise the focus?
I remember when I was on duty in the NMCC that I actually was a watch officer at the time that Israel struck the Al-Kibar reactor in Syria. And we were very on edge to watch for any Israeli activity, to tell you way too much about the situation. I remember the first indication that I got that something was up from Israel. I was tracking Turkish rural radio broadcasts that were translated by Phoebus, saying that some Turkish farmers had come across some F-15 drop tanks that had been dropped on their farm with Hebrew writing on it. That indicated Israel was going over the top of Syria. And when Israel dropped the bombs on Al-Kibar, the North Koreans kind of unmasked themselves. And right after the infrared event occurred, I remember the Korea People's News Bureau put out a condemnation of Israel, showing that they had people on the ground who were calling back to Pyongyang to say, hey, you need to condemn Israel right now, showing that that was probably North Korean scientists right there at the reactor site. I remember as the reactor got built, we compared it to the plans for the Yanban reactor. And it showed that the program was pretty much a unified program. There's long been a Iranian, North Korean, Syrian axis trying to pump nuclear technology into the region.
Congressman DeSantis, do you think there's more that Congress could do to address this rising ballistic missile threat from Iran?
Well, it was actually something that a lot of us were highlighting during these negotiations on this deal during the Obama administration, and there was really no fight at all over the ballistic missile. It was a concession in the early parts of the negotiation and was never really addressed in a substantive way after that. And I think we just have to assume, Senator Kirk is right, a lot of people don't realize that when Israel doesn't admit, but when Israel took out the Syrian reactor, how much involved North Korea was with that. So I think you have to look at what North Korea is doing with their missile program and their nuclear program, and we just have to assume that is going to be shared in some ways or sold in some ways with the Iranians. I'm a big supporter of really clamping down on Kim's regime. I want to cut off the money, hopefully destabilize. But he will definitely look. Whether he would use them against us, I don't know, but he would definitely look to spread them and to sell them in order to help finance his regime. So we know that much. So I think we have to look at those two as linked. But yeah, it's an issue that we have highlighted. I mean, I obviously would support additional sanctions on their ballistic missile program, but it's something that really should have been addressed. As flawed as the deal is in other respects. I mean, if you're going to do this deal to leave out the ballistic missile delivery capability and you leave the nuclear infrastructure intact, that allows them to continue on the missile advancement. And then once the deal elapses, even if they abide by every part of the deal, boom, they're a threshold nuclear state. They have the delivery capability.
Yeah. Let me just, before you address, I just want to explain one of the dangers of the ballistic missiles, as the senator said, they could already reach Israel. I mean, and that's for sure in parts of Europe. The fear for the United States is, and estimates I think differ, but people say within a decade it's possible they could have a ballistic missile that could reach the U.S. homeland. And by that point, they might have the nuclear capability, the ability to put a nuclear weapon on it, and then the American homeland is actually endangered. And I just want to explain, but Congressman, what do you...
You remember, Mark, the work we did on the X-band radar?
Yeah.
We teamed up on that.
We did that. We got the X-band. I remember sitting in the Pentagon where we were reviewing all the hot top assets of the United States. And I saw X-band and Tippy 2, Palmdale, California. And so I went to Israel and I said, hey, man, I got a good bipartisan issue for us. Let's get the X-band over to Israel. And we called up Cheney's office. And Cheney's office, suddenly I saw a rocket come from the White House to Transcom, immediately moved this X-band to Israel. And the cool thing about this was the X-band deployment to Israel was the first United States military deployment to protect the state of Israel. Right. And now AP just carried a story yesterday that we've just established another, Besalik, I think was the base in Israel. First Joint Command for all the anti-missile defenses, Arrow and everything, and Arrow 1, 2, and 3 to make sure that is...
That's the point I was going to make. Outside of imposing additional sanctions, I think the smartest thing the United States Congress has done, is doing, can continue to do, is plus up investments in Arrow 1, Arrow 2, Iron Dome, David Sling. Those ballistic missile defense technologies are priceless. And we all saw how Iron Dome worked on short-range missiles. It becomes much more complicated, much more difficult when you're talking about exo-atmospheric missiles. But every day that we delay those investments is a day too late. And so we've just got to ramp up in a very significant way, in a very accelerated way, our spending, our investments on ballistic missile defenses, particularly with an eye on Iran and North Korea. So one other thing, Mark, Kirk, and we didn't serve for much time together. I think I was pretty much out when you came in. But just to give you a sense of how bipartisan this issue is, and how effective UANI has been as a bipartisan organization. Told you I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. My job was to beat this guy, right? I never could because his district was just out of bounds for us. But my job was to beat Republicans and elect Democrats to the House of Representatives. And before I was a D-Trip chair, I was being groomed for that position. I was having a conversation with Rahm Emanuel, the most ruthless pit bull political operative in the world, in my view. And of course, you all know when a bill is introduced, the member of the majority always gets his or her name first, and being in the minority, mine would follow. And one day I was talking to Rahm Emanuel, I don't know if I ever told you the story, and he said, Israel, he said, I didn't know that there were 436 members of the House. And I said, Ron, there aren't. There's 435. He says, no, evidently there's a new guy named Kirk Israel. He keeps introducing all these resolutions on Iran. Who is that guy?
But I will remind you, Ron DeSantis cannot be beat.
Got it. No, right? Yeah.
Let me ask you just on the sanctions issue. It was alluded to earlier, but I don't think we addressed it. Do you think that if sanctions were imposed, new sanctions were reimposed on Iran, where would the Europeans be on this? For instance, the French, who were the toughest on the nuclear issue, the most hawkish. Before, of course, that was under a different government. The new president there, Macron, seemed very focused on the economy. I was there in June. I didn't get a sense that they really have any appetite or any interest in imposing new sanctions on Iran. But so one, do you think three questions. One, would the Europeans join in? Two, what would be the best way to get the Europeans to join in? And three, what would be the impact if it was just unilateral U.S. sanctions? And then I add, I think some people who have argued that the Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be pressing for some adjustment or a fix, as he says, or cancellation of the nuclear deal. I think there's some view of the Israelis that it's also a way, it's a stick, that decertification is a stick to pressure the Europeans. So obviously their oil sanctions that they imposed was very important, I think, in helping squeeze the Iranians. So I'd just like to see if any of you have thoughts about where Europe might be in all this, or would it be just a unilateral U.S. Legislative effort?
The bottom line is you need multilateral support.
Okay.
And I would say that multilateral support might be a bit overrated. When Bob Menendez and we had the Menendez-Kirk sanctions, we had an impact on the black market, which was more important than any impact. The black market on January 3rd, 2012, lost confidence in the Iranian currency, which is called the rial. It dropped about 70% of its value. So much so, I joked with my staff, said Iran was so out of money they had to skip a payment or two to Hezbollah. Yeah. we got. If you get the black market to lose confidence in the Iranian economy, there's an important point here. I think the best thing that we in UANI can do is redefine what a fiduciary means in the United States. If we say that you cannot be a certified fiduciary, the reason why I say this, that our banking sector is much more afraid of regulators than the Iranians. If we could say that no good fiduciary can invest in anything related to a terror state, because that's inherently unstable. I think if we redefine fiduciary, then we totally, the way to talk about this is to say that we totally insulate the American investor from the instability of a terrorist regime.
Congressman DeSantis, what do you see this on Europe?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't have a lot of confidence that the Europeans are necessarily going to see this stuff as clearly as they need to. I mean, we've seen other issues where they just haven't seen things with the same clarity that I think that we do here, or that our allies like Israel see it. And I think that they've made out pretty good financially with the fallout from this deal. So I think it's tough. But I do think that the president, by coming in as a critic of the Iran deal, making the trip to the Middle East where he was lining up the Sunni Arab countries from Egypt to the Gulf states, and they're wanting to line up behind him because of this Iran issue. So he's built a coalition there, but I think they have some work to do if they want the Europeans to follow suit.
Congressman Israel, do you think, you address that, but also do you think this decertification first is a stick, an effective stick against the Europeans, or would it be better to do private diplomacy first and just threaten this for a little while? I'm just curious.
I agree with Mark and with Ron that there will be some commercial resistance to decertification or sanctions? I mean, I guess you could find the answer by going to Martyrs of the Revolution Avenue in Tehran and go into any one of those countries' commercial offices that are renting there and leasing space there because they've all just, just ran to Tehran to open up business offices. And with respect to decertification as a stick, my argument at the beginning of this program was that there's a pre-stick, and just the threat of decertification, I think, may be sufficient enough to get more of our allies on board.
Let me ask you, I have a question here that it's relevant to the Iran issue. It gets to the issue more about what's going on the ground, but I think it's a very good question that someone asked, very relevant. There's an Iraqi-Kurdish referendum on September 25th. Now, I'm curious, I asked you this in the context of Iran, not necessarily in the context. Look, you have a Persian Iraq, you have a Shia Persian crescent from, Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut. Now you hear the words about land bridge and so on. But one of the peoples, it seems like, that could be standing in the way of this crescent possibly are the Kurds. And the Iraqi Kurds have historically been certainly very sympathetic to the United States. And they certainly have been, the Kurds have been one of the losers of history in the terms of not getting their own state after World War I. Now there's this referendum. You don't hear as much about officials talking about it, though. I was just in a meeting with Erdogan, President Erdogan yesterday, and he was very much against it. Do you think the United States should support an independent, Iraqi, Kurdish state in Iraq, and in the context of Iran, that this would be a way also to limit Iranian influence in the region? And I'll start with Senator Kirk on that.
I would say they already are. Now let's take friendship for, let's take yes for an answer. When you look in Sulaymaniyah, it's so pro-American and pro-Israeli. Yeah. We should just go ahead with de facto bilateral relationship. Make sure that and the best thing is to arm the Kurds. Now that they're the essence of the roll on Raqqa.
Yeah.
I think that is the most important thing.
And should we I'd like to ask you, Congressman DeSantis, and the same question also, do you think we should consider having a military base in Iraqi Kurdistan?
Well, I think that they are an ally. I think strategically it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Iran would oppose that, which we shouldn't matter to us. Turkey will oppose it, but I mean, I got to tell you, I don't see Turkey as quite the ally that we had hoped years ago. That's just the reality. They've moved in a more Islamist direction, and I think we just have to accept that. And we had issues with arming the Kurds because you'd have to send it through the government of Iraq and all these other things, and it just wasn't effective. So I would say have a relationship where you can arm them directly because I think it's very difficult to find good proxy forces in the Middle East because you can arm some of these Sunni Arabs and maybe they'll be aligned with you one day, but man, the next day it's suicide bombs. So these folks are pretty good proxy forces and pretty good allies. And so I was disappointed in the statement that came out, I think it was by the White House or by Tillerson, basically throwing cold water on this whole thing. That's not, I think, the posture that we should be taking.
Congressman Israel.
Look, I agree we ought to take yes for an answer. They're already extremely helpful to us on the issue of whether we actually put a military base or have a military footprint there. I would always defer to the judgment and the wisdom of military planners and leaders and strategists and let them make that decision.
By the way, I'll add that Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think, made a statement the other day supporting, Kurdish state in Iraq, and the Israelis have said that before. So it's actually a very interesting development, and it's endemic of problems, issues the United States needs to face in the region. Look, I want to thank this very distinguished panel for shedding light on this very issue, and thanking UANI for hosting. Thank you, Congressman.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, good to see you.
Where's your district?
It's at Daytona and St. Augustine. Yeah.
Oh, we do a lot with the military.